So one of my favorite quotes, I've been told that I use it several times a year, is borrowing from the introduction to the landslide management standard written by Inga. Today, I no longer have to borrow from the original author of those words, as he's a guest on this show and gives us exclusive use to the use of the word geezer. We are not changing the name of the series from the Sage series to the Geezer series, but today we do enjoy a great conversation with a well-known geezer in the industry covering all sorts of topics from ASME B318S to, again, the challenges in standard development today.
One-armed metallurgist.
And yes, hear about one-armed metallurgist today on Pipeline Things. Boom! Welcome to today's edition of Pipeline Things. I am your host, Rhett Dotson, my co-host, Christopher De Leon. It is a pleasure to be with you guys again as we continue our Sage series. So, really excited about today's guest because I feel like he almost needs no introduction to give the audience some clues. This particular gentleman, it's like his reputation precedes him, but I love to quote him. I've probably quoted his introduction to the landslide, the Inga management of landslides JIP, probably
at least 10 times on this podcast.
10 times on this podcast.
Yeah.
It's probably something I feel like I have the need to do like once or twice a year. It's just so well written. Yeah. But really great with jokes, lots of great humor. Chris, before when we were doing a little research for the Sage series and we reached out to him.
Who are the candidates, right?
Getting candidates, right? This one told us that he doesn't buy green bananas anymore.
And it takes you a little while to think about it. And if you are a little bit witty, you're like,
which I was not. I was like, what is green?
I think I get it.
So
do you still buy green bananas? And we're not talking about like Grinch Christmas where you do like the elf on the shelf where like you have one banana that the Grinch touched.
I wonder, does Trip S, does she eat bananas? This is a question. All right, so she's a banana fan. Okay. So but anyway, I tell you what, I'm gonna read our guest is a co-author on the book By God If I Were in Charge.
Not just standards across the industry, but also this book.
I think what he wrote actually in his section, really, if I had thought about this before we did the Sage series, I probably would have used it as the introduction to the Sage series. Because it's really well written. It summarizes, I think, what we're trying to capture.
Yeah, the importance of sages.
Absolutely. And it says, speaking of grandchildren, whether you are reading this early, mid, or later in your life and career, you are probably working with people who are not too different in age from your grandparents, parents, children, or even grandchildren, right? So to our audience out there, stop for a moment. Think about those people in your career, maybe even in your life that you're surrounded by that are same age as people that you would consider mentors or people you maybe get advice from even in your own family. And he says, what are you learning from them and what are they learning from you? And a little further down, he says, if you are younger, seek out the geezer down the hall. His words, not ours. He may not be as grumpy as he appears and may have some knowledge or experience that is useful to you. If you are one of the geezers, again, his words, not ours, keep your door open, figuratively and literally. You are valuable not because you know things. You are valuable because you share that knowledge.
If you share that knowledge, right?
If you share that knowledge. Yeah. But I thought it's such a great opening. Such a great introduction to what we're trying to accomplish in the Sage series and why this particular individual we bring on. So I think without further ado, we go ahead and bring him on. It's my pleasure to introduce the audience to Dave Johnson, better known as Dr. Dave, or more affectionately known as Dr. Dave within the industry.
If you know Dave Johnson, you know it's Dr. Dave.
Indeed you do.
Welcome.
And so, Dave, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Rhett.
As he takes some time to get into his seat, I'll just say I've had the pleasure in crossing paths with Dr. Dave for many stages of my career, going back to when I was a consultant at Stress Engineering, and it's certainly my pleasure to have him on today. So I'd like to say welcome.
Yeah, I've gone into his open door many a time when I had the opportunity to meet you at Panhandle Energy and learn a whole lot. So geezers are funny, and you can take a lot from them.
And I say this particular geezer is actually fairly cultured. He's into Broadway shows and other things. So we have a cultured geezer on the show. But that's not why we brought him on today. We brought him on. Dr. will you please introduce yourself? Who are you? Why are you a sage in the industry? What brings you to us today?
Well, good morning. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I guess I'm considered a sage in the industry because I lasted a long time. And I know, I really don't know how old you are, Rhett. I know about how old you are. And I know that you had not probably even been thought of when I started my career in this industry. I started a long time ago with Northern Natural Gas in Omaha, Nebraska in 1979. I was a refugee from the nuclear industry. I joined Northern shortly after the 3 Mile Island nuclear incident. And it looked like the nuclear industry was not going to be very healthy and have a lot of career opportunities for a number of years. I think that was probably accurate because I don't think any nuclear plants have been built since 3 Mile Island. So I bailed out into natural gas at Northern in '79. Northern changed its name to InterNorth, and InterNorth was one of the companies that merged to form Enron. I think you probably all heard of Enron.
Maybe not everybody has anymore.
Well,
you never
I'd
know.
be surprised.
Yeah.
As I meet people now, they don't even realize Minute Maid Park was formerly Enron Field. There are a number of younger people in the
You might actually have some.
that.
You might have some juice box, i.e., Enron Field swag. I bet.
I have an Enron Field cap. I have an Enron Field opening day baseball.
Wow.
I have worn my Enron Field cap to games at Minute Maid Park.
Yeah, that is awesome.
Which was kind of fun. It got some laughs and some kind of side eye looks, but that's okay. So went through the Enron experience, and I don't regret going through that, but I certainly don't want to do it again.
Sure.
And then after Enron cratered and spun off the pipelines, we were acquired by Southern Union, which was the owner of Panhandle Energy. And then Panhandle was acquired by Energy Transfer. And about the time we got deep in several months into the COVID pandemic, it was time to retire. So I pulled the plug and stayed home.
And are you truly retired now?
I am retired. I've done a little bit of consulting, but not for, I don't know, a year and a half or so. So we're just kicking back, doing some traveling, enjoying driving back and forth to see the grandkids do stuff and spend time with them. And
well, congratulations.
Awesome. Yeah.
Well, we are happy to drag you back to offer your wisdom.
Yeah, but also talk a little bit about yourself. So for the audience, I mean, I think one of the things we like to do with our podcast is for people to get to know our guests, right? So people feel like if you listen to us long enough, you know a little bit about Rhett and I and our families and what we like and don't like. Dr. Dave, what's your PhD in? Tell us a little bit more about you, because you were nuclear, then you went to pipelines. Like, what was your focus?
I'm a metallurgist, and for any of you who are maybe still thinking about a specialty, metallurgy is great. It really is.
This makes me think of Fudge's statement. Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
If you enjoy reading tea leaves or looking into which direction your latte foam goes, metallurgy is
or if you want to be able to use this answer for everything,
it
depends.
If you actually want an answer to a question, you need to ask a one-armed metallurgist, because if you don't, he's going to say, well, on the one hand and on the other hand.
And now the audience knows what I mean about Dr. Dave's wit. It is going to come out.
Talk to your geezers, all right? They're good at telling stories, and they'll teach you something.
So my oldest grandson is a senior in high school this year, and it appears as though he is going to go to Texas A&M University and probably major in engineering, likely mechanical engineering. I have counseled him a little bit about metallurgy because you got all these engineering fields, and they're all interesting and technical and useful. But you got the mechanicals and the electricals and the civils and nukes and all these folks, and they are all designing and building things. And occasionally and inevitably, some of the things that those guys and women design and build break.
Occasionally.
But it's going to happen. Things break. It's an imperfect world. So when they break, the metallurgist comes in to assist and do the materials part of the failure investigation. So what the metallurgist gets to do is find fault and assign blame for what other people have done. It's a great job. It's a great
and
career.
It's rarely you.
So yeah, I got my PhD in metallurgy at Purdue University, who is currently occupying the number one spot in basketball rankings.
Yeah,
which is as it should be.
Until U of H gets a hold of them, but that's another topic for another day. That's another topic for another day.
We'll talk about that later.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I do what so a lot of the sages that we brought onto the show, obviously Rhett and I have some form of a relationship with them, and I exactly what you said in the book is exactly what I remember, right? So I was a double E coming out of U of H, and I got thrown into pipeline integrity, and obviously we understand the threats and managing an integrity program. And I was very fortunate to have these sages, right? I had Dr. Dave, you there with us. I remember at the time, David McQuillan, Q on our corrosion side, and Jerry Rowell. So I was very fortunate. I'd come in, and normally when you and I would interact is because we were trying to understand something that probably wasn't solved or lessons learned. So exactly what you said in the book is what I remember talking to you and taking staple statements from you, right? Things that I was able to latch on. The other thing that I remember is you're very active in the industry. You know, I remember you saying, hey, Christopher, we're working on this INGA initiative or this INGA project. I need you to do this for me, right? Or, hey, we're working at PRCI, or we're working on this standard. So maybe you can walk us through a little bit of your history as it relates to your involvement, not just within a specific pipeline organization, but maybe some of the broader industry stuff.
Sure. I think it's important to be involved, to have the interactions, to meet some of the people, if for no other reason than when something comes up, crosses your desk or hits you in the face out in the field, and you haven't seen it before, and there are some people that you can call and say, hey, have you ever seen one of these, or what does this look like to you? So yes, involvement and interactions are really important, and there are probably three that I can think of. I'm going to leave something out probably, but
with 40
three,
years of
we'll give you that.
You'll leave a few out. It's okay.
That's okay.
But three main areas that people can be involved in to have these interactions. One is their industry trade associations.
Sure.
And those are organizations like INGA and AGA and
API.
Yes.
Yeah.
And those, they get together and share information. Those organizations typically are also lobbying organizations, so they try to influence legislation and regulations primarily at the federal level, but some of the trade associations, like the state ones or regional ones, work with state agencies also.
Sure.
And some of them are more educational than lobbying, like SGA is more of an educational information exchange than say INGA, which is lobbying. A second group is the R&D arm of the industry. It's organizations like PRCI and NYSERC, GTI, Southwest Research, and there are others that investigate phenomena and try to solve some of do the research to try to solve some of the industry's problems. And you meet a lot of really, really smart people in those organizations. And then the third one is the standards development organizations. And API also does standards, but ASME, NFPA, the
New AMP, formerly NACE, stuff like that.
That write the standards. And you like to have kind of a flow. So if an issue is identified, you want to do enough research on the issue that you have an adequate background knowledge, so you know what a standard should say, how to address the issue. And then you develop the standard. It goes through a sometimes pretty lengthy development process to get it approved. And then you take that standard to the agencies or to the legislators and lobby to have that standard used as a basis for regulations or incorporated into the regulations. So that's kind of the idealistic way of how this works. It doesn't always, sometimes the regulation comes first and then you have to do the work to see is the regulation practical? Is it achievable? Can we do it? Does it make sense?
I don't know how common this is. I mean, Rhett and I are pretty involved in the standards process. What are your thoughts on, for some of our audience, do you need to be a sage or have 10 plus years experience to contribute in any of these three groups that you talked about, industry organizations, research organizations, or standards committees?
No. I think there are going to be people in those groups who have 10, 20, 30, 40 years of experience. But that's where you get experience and where you learn things. So I think starting out as a young, relatively new engineer in the industry, it's a great experience to get involved in one or more of those kinds of organizations to get to know people. You learn things, and you'll go to meetings and come away. If you pay attention, you will come away with several things that you've jotted down that you did not know before.
Yeah, I want to parrot off that a little bit. I put a brief plug for B318 because I sit currently as the vice chair of O&M on ASME B318. We interacted there in my early days on that, and you don't have to be an expert to sit on that committee. And we do have a significant need for more volunteers, particularly from the industry. And I've been surprised at the number of things it's forced me to learn about, right? Yes. So what I mean is that often things come either inquiries into the 318 committee or recommendations for changes. And the discussion can get quite hot. And usually the hotter the discussion, it means the more that I need to learn. So I've been forced to learn about things like why we do casings and vents a certain way, why they have to be metallic, the problems with non-metallic casings. I've even learned other things about valves and set points that I had no idea, that as you get into, you realize like, oh, wow, it is a great way to both meet people as well as to get information on topics that I otherwise would have very little interaction with.
Rhett, you might have heard this from me a couple of times in one of our former employers, and we were building a pretty big team of integrity engineers. And at least my experience and my upbringing, right, was you have a team of complementary disciplines, right? And so we had SMEs on our team when we were energy transfer, Southern Union Panhandle, with people who focused on certain disciplines. And it allowed you to learn enough about your neighbors to be dangerous is kind of the way I thought about it, right? So I was a little bit of a jack of all trades, but my SME was inline inspection for ILI assessments, right? And we were fortunate enough, and I'm speaking to the audience now, right? I was pretty blessed to have the opportunity to participate in all three of those types of organizations that you mentioned, right? So participating in some of the consensus groups like API, ASME, getting to go to PRCI, getting to participate in standards, but not that I was contributing to standards, but if not, I was asked to do tasks related to the standard. Like I remember an Inga project that you gave me, you were like, hey, we're looking at some of these material properties and how it relates to the impact of hydro testing. Can you go run this analysis for me? And so, yeah, I had to run numbers, but the reason for the numbers really opened my mind up. I was like, well, this is great. I understand what we're trying to do. And I think it helps connect the dots. So I would just encourage you guys, if you guys are if you have a relationship with your mentor, with your supervisor, with the geezer down the hall or on a different floor, be courageous, right? Raise your hand, ask questions, ask for an opportunity to get involved. And it doesn't have to necessarily mean that you can add value through your experience, but if not, you could be some of the working hands that help get tasks completed. And in that, I mean, it ends up becoming incredible, right? So just a little plug there, and definitely agree with your comment there.
So I think this is a good, I actually want to use this as an opportunity in all the time that you spent on standards. And I know you were one of the people that had a lot of input into 31.8S. You were around when PRCI was PRC, I assume, before it was the PRCS. And so what do you think, what are some learnings that you would share there in terms of how standard development has gone? We as an industry have approached maybe standards and regulations looking forward to the future. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
The standards process, generally tends to be a very deliberate process. The issues and you know from your time on B31.8, and I spent a lot of time on B31.8 and B31.8S. We used to joke about the glacial pace that
we still joke about it.
That some of the items moved through. Here's one from 2005. Yeah, are we going to do this? Work continues. So it tends to be a very deliberate process, and it is at times frustrating because people and companies and supervisors and managers, when they want something, they would prefer to have had it yesterday or on their desk when they came in this morning, and not next week or next month or next year. We'll have that. So there's always a push to get things done faster. But standards are one of the things that I think need to be done very deliberately. I keep using that word, but with a lot of thought about where it's going and the potential for unintended consequences of taking an action.
I want to jump in there, and maybe as an industry, us being more engaged sometimes, I feel, because there is a structure in the standards process, right? So there are technical reports available where you can go in and see where industry has come together to research a topic and say, here are some of the findings we have. And then often you could see a technical report that evolves into an RP, like a recommended practice, right? So if we were to give you an example there, API RP 1183 is the recommended practice for dents. But then after the RP is vetted, then it can become a standard, right? So you don't always have to jump to the standard, right? There is a process in the standards making that allows for experience and maturity of what we're proposing, right? And then it can become a standard like API standard 1163, which is how we qualify ILI systems.
You know, it's interesting. I have to jump in because you mentioned 1183, Chris.
Yeah.
And I happen to sit on 31.8 and 1183. And the way those two, so one is a consensus standard,
Yes.
and the other behaves very differently.
Yes.
1183 was developed opposite of glacial and opposite of deliberate, and we are fully in the middle of seeing the challenges with that now, right?
Yeah.
And the number of consultants that have raised concerns about the methods, the structure, the use of 1183. Totally different process. Consensus voting, majority wins type thing. I think you need 2/3.
Yeah.
Sitting on ASME B318, speaking to Dave's point, it is often frustrating because you need unanimous consent to get things passed. And oftentimes I find myself arguing with one individual who will hold things up that I have to convince them of the technical merits or why that's the case. On the flip side, I will
I'm not
say...
on the committee anymore.
No, you're not. It's not you. It's Keith. Don't tell, but it's Keith.
Okay.
It is surprising. You don't see that is a standard B318 that has endured the test of time, if you will.
Yeah.
And so I really will. I find very, very close to my heart what Dave was speaking about. Sometimes that glacial pace, while frustrating, is so important.
Yeah, and again, for you guys, the takeaway, right, is it's when you grab a document, it is important for you to appreciate how the document came about and what its intent is, right? So if you see a technical report, or you see an IPC paper, or you see a report from PRCI, or it's an RP, a recommended practice, or a standard, right? Just have an appreciation for what document am I reading, and then have an appreciation for what is that possible path that it took to get that document published before you use it.
So this is actually... Oh, what were you going to say?
Well, you mentioned the DENT standards, and the DENTs are very interesting. That whole subject, and I think it leads us to thinking, okay, once we get a standard, let's make sure that we understand that we still may have some things to learn that may impact that standard or how we apply it. DENTs, for years and years and years, we in the industry said plain DENTs that are relatively shallow are innocuous. Just
recode them.
Yeah, just recoat and go. If the coating is damaged, if the coating is not damaged, just leave it alone.
Put dirt back on it.
Backfill it and go. Well, then to me, not too many years ago.
And for the record, Rhett is very uncomfortable right now. If you're watching
I'm
him.
thinking of the Centerville episode from the Failure Files, and I'm trying to keep a straight face.
Well, I'm sorry, because we didn't talk about this going here, but I think it's an important illustration of we need to keep our eyes and our minds open to things, maybe something happening that you think that shouldn't have happened. That's not right. But it is, and you may have to change your mind about things, because what we found over the last several years is that even in shallow DENTs, we can nucleate fatigue cracks. Mm-hmm. And depending on the nature of the DENT and how the stresses are applied, the fatigue cracks can be longitudinal or they can be transverse. Mm-hmm. And they can occur in the bottom of the DENT or up on the shoulder of the DENT. And what they look like when the metallurgists look at them, look at the surface.
One-armed or two-armed?
Two.
Okay.
Always two. They look like little colonies of stress corrosion cracks because you may get multiple cracks nucleated. So my personal opinion is that over the years, over the decades, there have probably been in pipelines where we have found some of these things, a number of crack families that have been classified as stress corrosion cracks that were actually fatigue cracks.
I wonder at that point if it's because they went to the metallurgist and asked him, and he said it depends. But in order to know that, we're going to take a break, and you'll have to come back to hear the answer to that question. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back to Pipeline Things with our esteemed guest, Dr. Dave. So when we left you, we were in the middle of discussing. Dr. Dave brought up, some of the challenges that can happen when you rush a standard, and I immediately gravitated. Chris incidentally brought up 1183, but I was very clearly able to relate. 1183 versus 31.8 and the differences in the speed with which those were developed. And that is something that is ongoing that the industry is working through right now.
But maybe not the speed they were developed, maybe how change is managed, right? Maybe how 1183 was developed, but how B31.8 is potentially being changed.
Let's just say the development processes as a whole, right?
Yeah.
One is glacial, one moves rapid pace,
Yeah.
One is majority consensus, one
There
you
you
have
go.
to have near uniform
Yeah.
voting.
Perfect.
Dave, you kind of had your own experiences nearly 24 years ago, I guess, in the development of 31.8S. And I'd like for you to share a little bit, maybe help our audience understand briefly the history of 31.8S. And it was a similar, very quickly assembled document, was it not?
31.8S, I think, certainly at the time, I believe it was the fastest publication of a standard that ASME had done, at least in the pipeline area. It was about a year.
From start to finish,
Yes.
31.8S.
Yes, and it was a very intense year. We had meetings with the regulators and with the advisory committees. At the time it was called TPSSC. I think it's the Transmission Advisory Committee or Gas Transmission Advisory Committee. There's gas and liquid committees. But we had meetings with them about every month to 6 weeks for a period of about a year. And in those meetings, we would bring in our researchers and present the work, whatever the topic was. If the topic was dense or corrosion or stress corrosion cracking or third-party damage or whatever the subject was, we would bring in the people who had done the work on that subject for us at PRCI or at Inga Foundation, NISEARCH, any of the research organizations. So these are people like, and I don't mean to leave anybody out, but it's people like Brian Lease, Battelle, John Kiefner, Bill Bruce and DNV and the other folks there, maybe some Southwest Research, and others certainly, but people of that caliber were coming in to present what their work and their conclusions on certain areas. So we were trying to set a background for the regulators so they would understand what we were writing in the standard. So we wrote it then very quickly, and we had different little task groups for different sections that put it together, and then tried to edit it so it all fit the ASME templates and style guide and all that, and looked like it was done by one author, not by a
I want to ask
whole
you,
bunch.
20 years later, is it surprising how I almost want to say central that document has become? I mean, because there are tenets in there that are like Moses came down off of the mountain with them.
And
did y'all envision when you were writing it that it would be that, I don't want to use the word lasting, but that had that kind of permanency?
I think we thought that it would be a lasting document. I think we didn't anticipate it being essentially so set in stone so early. Moses didn't bring this down. This was not engraved in tablets of stone. It's a document that we did the best we could with what we had and the time that we had to do it. And again, we were the industry was under a lot of pressure to develop this standard very quickly because the integrity regulations were upon us, and the regulators wanted something.
So can we highlight that a little bit? Can you maybe elaborate on what that relationship looked like? What was the role that the standard B30 had with the formulation of regulation?
The regulators, PHMSA was under the gun to write integrity management regulations. And we met with them in late 1999 and said, okay, we will help you with this and we'll develop a standard, but you need to go along with us. And we'll keep you up to speed, and we'll have meetings and exchange information and do all of that. So that's what we did, and it was a relatively collaborative process between us and the regulators as we wrote the standard. But that's not to say that
Sure.
Like in any organization, there were some people in PHMSA who didn't like it from the beginning.
Sure.
Didn't like the process. Thought that industry had too much say in what was going into it. But we did it very quickly, and some of the points of contention, I think, exist to this day.
And are very difficult to change, if you will. And that was where my joke about Moses coming down off the mountain is like, probably the most famous one, we talked about it several times, is the figure four. It's no longer figure four, but everybody
knows it's
what
figure
is
four.
Figure four. There are better methods now for determining reassessment intervals. Some that have even gone through the research organizations. Mike Rosenfeld's put forth a ballot to have it changed to an equation that better reflects corrosion growth. My God, Dave, to try and get that passed through is like heaven and earth. We've been working on it for almost 3 years, right? Mm-hmm. And it is so that glacial pace you see there in that, right? I think another one that immediately comes to mind is the permanency of the 21 threats that were existed there. They're almost like the 10 Commandments, literally. It's like there are 21 threats, and thou shalt have no others. And I don't think when y'all wrote it you intended that, but it is amazing that once something like that is put together, the permanency and the challenges you can experience as an industry in trying to then modify that after the fact.
Well, and even in how we talk about it, we talk about the 21 threats, and we have now regulations, and companies have in their policies and procedures on how they do things. Mm-hmm. These things are all woven throughout that. And to make any sort of significant change is a major upheaval for a lot of people. It's major changes in the regulations. It's major changes in companies' policies and procedures, in the written documents, and perhaps some major changes in how they have to do things, the things that they have to do. But those have, again, in my opinion, have caused us some issues in how we talk about these things and how we address them. And I don't know, my last couple of years before I bailed out of all of this, I was advocating re-looking at these and moving closer to root causes rather than proximate causes
of failures. Why is the coating and CP failing? Not why do you have corrosion on the pipeline?
Right.
Or assessing for corrosion.
Right.
I wanna maybe tie in one of our previous podcast series. So the one we just finished was called Failure Files, where we looked at several NTSB investigations and how that led to some of the current regulations that we have. What are some of your thoughts on maybe the role or timing or relationship between industry develops a standard and regulation potentially using that standard to govern versus what I would say over the last 15 years, the trend is really more, it feels like We're not leveraging a standard like we did with B318S 2004, which is still incorporated, but rather we're not really turning to standards anymore. It's management by consequence. Oh, you had a failure on this mode, i.e. material properties. Now here's regulation on material properties. You had a failure on dents. Oh, now here's how we're going to regulate dents. You had a failure in a non-HCA. Here's how we're now going to manage non-HCA areas. What are your thoughts about that relationship and the role? And basically, because it goes to timing, right? Timing of standards development.
The timing is difficult, and I think the regulators have a lot of pressure because they get NTSB recommendations from the failures, and they get congressional mandates.
Yeah.
And they pretty much have to respond to those, or they get bad grades, and they get their administrator gets publicly beat up in congressional committee hearings. And I think you can go back and find some of that on YouTube, and it's pain. Some of those are painful to watch.
Yeah.
So that they're kind of maybe this is too strong a word, but they're kind of in self-preservation mode. But they have to respond to those things. But what happens is, and I'll use a different DOT mode for this. TSA, and don't get me wrong, I love TSA, and I really like their.
I'm very curious where this is going.
I am so curious.
I'm like, where is this going?
Their scanners and all that. Yeah, it's really fun, especially if you got a lot of titanium in your body. But
animanium for some of us.
Yeah. Some of the things that have been done for safety by TSA for airlines. And this isn't something I made up. Yeah, you can find articles on this. What their regulations do is prevent the last incident.
Yes, 100%.
So there was the shoe bomber guy.
Right.
So now you got a regulation. You got to take off your shoes and have your shoes inspected. It's really kind of understandable, because when you have something like that, you want to make sure that it doesn't propagate, that you don't have it again. And of course the big one for the gas transmission industry was the incident in San Bruno, and that drove a lot of the regulations that have been coming out now. And those regulations were a long time coming from the notice of the advanced notice of proposed regulation, which they got comments on, then the notice of proposed regulation, and then it was split into multiple parts and had all the comments on that, and that was a long, drawn out process. Some of the comments that they got, they accepted, some they didn't. That's how things go. But you're right, Christopher. That's the incidents were driving the regulations, and it's and I've never been a huge defender of PHMSA, but in this case, in many instances, it's not their doing, and it's probably not the way they would prefer to do things, but they get mandates that you have to these things happened, and the NTSB report found these deficiencies, so you make regulations about those things.
Makes sense.
And I don't think we have much control over PHMSA and congressional mandates, but we do have control over sometimes where our industry is maybe heading now. And so as we wrap up this episode, I want to leave our listeners with a thought, because Dave talked about 318S and it being developed in response to, at that time, notable failures and the need for regulation, and it was rushed. I have my own experiences with, again, 1183. And these aren't the only issues that we're facing. right? So as an industry, I want you guys to think we're facing the advent of CO2.
Yep.
There's nothing really governing CO2 pipelines right now. Hydrogen and blending, right? There's a huge push to rapidly get an ASME standard govern that. So if you're serving in those standards or if you're participating, ask yourself maybe, is there a place for that glacial process, or where do the principles of that glacial process maybe need to fit to prevent, some of what we talked about here? And that's, again, I want to leave the audience with that cliffhanger. I don't want to address it. I just want you to be thinking about that as we close out this podcast and maybe in the rest of your ride home or wherever it is you find yourself listening to us. But I do want to say, Dr. Dave, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
This will not be called the Geezer series. This will remain the Sage series.
Yeah.
But myself, Christopher, Dr. Dave, want to thank you for joining us on Pipeline Things. Look forward to being back with you in 2 more weeks.